She was 22 and homeless. No family left to take her in, no roof of her own, just a small brass spice scale worn warm by 4 generations of women's hands, and a single-thumbed index card with 3 words written in faded German cursive on it, Niemals den Rauch, and 3 single-dollar bills she had earned washing dishes at a roadside cafe outside Fredericksburg. And with that $3, she bought a limestone block smokehouse and butcher cottage on a curve of the Pedernales River, 2 miles down a county road off Old Comfort Road in the settlement of Hugel Bend in Gillespie County, Texas, in a stretch of the hill country that had not seen post-oak smoke rise from its chimney since the summer of 1962. The tin roof had rusted through in long red seams. The limestone of the smoke chamber stood black with 60 years of pitch and time. But what nobody knew, least of all Annalise Brower herself, was that hidden behind one loose limestone block in the back wall of the smoke chamber was something her great-great-grandmother had sealed there in 1904 that would change her life forever. Before we go on, if these stories mean something to you, take a moment and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. It means more than you know to see how far these stories travel. She had seen the cottage on a hand-lettered card thumbtacked to the bulletin board of the H-E-B grocery in Fredericksburg. Limestone smokehouse and small cottage, 3 acres, river frontage, $3 or best offer. See Mr. Reinhard Kessler at the county records office. She had $7 folded in the inside pocket of her workshirt, the last of 2 weeks of dish wages. She drove the borrowed pickup back to the cafe where she had been sleeping on a folding cot in the dry storage room, and went the next morning to the records office and asked for Mr. Reinhard Kessler by name. Mr. Kessler was 78 years old and had been the assistant clerk of Gillespie County for 41 of those years. He looked up at her over the long oak counter when she said her name, looked at her over the top of his bifocals, and went very still. "Brower," he said slowly, the German hard in the word, the way only an old hill country German says a German name, "from Hugel Bend. You'd be Wilhelmina's great-granddaughter then." Annie nodded once. He folded his bifocals and walked back into a small windowless storeroom without another word. He came back 2 minutes later with a heavy iron key on a piece of waxed butcher twine, the key warm from being held in a drawer for many years. $3, he said. "We have been holding this place 41 years. Your great-grandmother left it with the office in 1985 with word to give it cheap to whoever the smokehouse called. Nobody called. Until now." She paid him 3 soft paper dollars, signed her name, and he walked her to the door and set his old hand for 1 second on her shoulder. And he said very softly, in the old hill country German almost nobody in town spoke anymore, "Willkommen daheim." Welcome home. She had grown up with the smell of post-oak smoke, with the slow, sweet, almost peppered smell of pork shoulder hanging in a smoke chamber on a hot July afternoon, with the dry mineral smell of black pepper and mustard seed warming in a copper bowl on her grandmother's kitchen table, with the green sharp smell of garlic crushed under the flat side of a butcher knife, with the deep cellar smell of cured salt pork in a stoneware crock. She had grown up under the limestone arches of her grandmother's small back-of-house smokehouse in Cherry Spring, sitting cross-legged on the cool flagstone floor when she was 3 and 4 years old, the dry, pleasant heat of the smoke chamber against her bare arms, watching the slow, patient working of her grandmother's hands as they tied the casings and hung the sausage links on the iron rods. She had grown up knowing, before she had words for it, that smoking is mostly the wood, and that the hands are only the part you see. Her grandmother was Elsbeth Brower, born in 1935, the only daughter of Friedrich and Hilde Brower. She had learned to cure and to smoke at the side of her own mother, on the same hand-built smoke chamber and the same hand-pegged sausage stuffer her great-grandmother Wilhelmina Brower had built in 1891. Elsbeth was small and broad, with the strong, square hands of a butcher's daughter, her gray hair worn in a single short plait pinned over the back of her head. Annie had called her Oma from the first day she could shape the sound. Annie's mother and father had both died young, her mother in childbirth with a brother who did not live when Annie was 4, and her father 2 years later of a heart that had been quietly failing, so the days had belonged to Oma since Annie was 6. She learned to tie a sausage casing on a wooden dowel before she could write her name. By 6, she could weigh a 4-ounce portion of curing salt against the small brass spice scale to within 1/8 of an ounce. By 8, she could grind a coarse hill country sausage filling at the right temperature. By 10, she could load a cold smoke chamber with 80 pounds of pork belly for bacon and tend the post oak fire through the side door without ever letting the temperature climb above 110. By 12, she could read a smoke by its color. The pale, thin blue of a clean post oak fire, the heavier white of an overtended fire choked with green wood, the gray gold of a fire fed too much fresh black pepper, the dark sour of a fire fed any wood other than post oak or mesquite. By 15, she had cured and smoked 60 whole hams of her own. By 18, she had finished 113 and had learned every one of the 26 small recipes Oma kept in her head and would not write down. Oma, on a hot Tuesday morning in late August in Annie's 18th year, walked out of the smokehouse with a small cured ham wrapped in clean linen and laid it in Annie's hands at the back kitchen door, and said, in German, "Du bist jetzt eine Räucherin." You are a smokehouse woman now. The smoke knows you, the wood knows you, the salt knows you. And then she said, and there is one thing left I have not yet taught you, and it cannot be taught in the smokehouse. Come into the kitchen. But before Annie or Elsbeth, there had been Wilhelmina. Wilhelmina Brauer had come from a small village outside Marburg in the German state of Hessen in the autumn of 1846, 23 years old, with her young husband, Johann Brauer, on a ship of the Adelsverein. She carried in her wooden trunk a single hand-forged butcher's knife from her father's village shop, her mother's brass spice scale, a packet of mustard seed and caraway seed and coriander seed wrapped in linen, and the recipes for 19 sausages, 9 cures, and 4 smoked meats memorized whole in her head, because her mother had taught her that a written recipe was a recipe a stranger could steal. The Adelsverein had promised land. The Adelsverein had also lied. The Brauers landed at Indianola in October of 1846 and walked north toward Fredericksburg in a winter so wet the trail became a string of mud holes a foot deep, and Johann took the cholera south of New Braunfels and died in the back of an ox cart on a cold dawn in December, and was buried under a live oak by the side of the road. Wilhelmina walked the last 40 miles to Fredericksburg alone, a widow, the brass scale in her apron pocket, the butcher's knife at her hip, the recipes still in her head. She hired herself out as a meat cutter to a butcher named Caspar Ottmer, who was the first man in the village to see her work a sausage and to understand, by the second hour, what kind of butcher's daughter had walked into his shop. She worked for him 6 years. She saved every coin. In 1853, she bought 3 acres on a curve of the Pedernales River in a small settlement of 9 German families called Hugel Bend, paid $11 for the 3 acres, and built her own house with her own hands, course by course, of cut limestone blocks taken from her own outcrop. And behind the house, against the limestone bluff itself, she built a smokehouse 8 feet by 12, with walls 2 feet thick and a chimney built straight into the live limestone, so that the smoke chamber breathed against cold stone in summer and warm stone in winter. She wrote nothing down. She remarried Heinrich Brauer, her late husband's cousin, who took her name to keep it from dying out, and the smokehouse at Hugel Bend supplied 4 ranches and the long Sunday picnic table of the Hugel Bend Kirche for the next 58 years, until Wilhelmina was 81 and went into the smokehouse on a cool October morning in 1904 and did the one thing she had sworn she would never do. Oma had 3 rules. The first was this: the smoke does not lie. You can lie to yourself about the meat, about the salt, about the time. The smoke does not lie. If the smoke is dark, the fire is wrong. If the smoke is white, the wood is wrong. If the smoke is gray, the spice is wrong. Read the smoke, child, the way another woman reads a face. The second was this: the post oak is the soul. Other wood will smoke a meat. Hickory will, mesquite will, pecan will. But the hill country was given to us with the post oak, and a Brauer smokehouse smokes with post oak, or it does not smoke. The third she said the day she walked Annie out of the smokehouse on Annie's 18th birthday: Niemals den Rauch ohne die Liebe. Never the smoke without the love. A smokehouse woman can do everything else right. She can cure at the right temperature, grind to the right size, read the wood and the weather, tie the casings tight. But if she is angry when she lights the fire, the meat will be wrong and she will not know why. but the people at the table will. That is the only one of these three rules that matters. The others are method. This one is the trade. And then Oma walked into the kitchen, took from the top shelf of the corner cupboard a small wooden recipe box of mountain laurel wood rubbed soft with use, and set it on the kitchen table. Inside were index cards, hundreds of them. The first card was dated October the 14th, 1904. Each card was a recipe, a cure, a smoke schedule, a spice grind, written first in Wilhelmina's hand, then in her daughter's, then in Oma's mother's, then in Oma's own clear cursive. The card on top, freshly added that morning, was titled Annie's Wurst. Oma had set her hand on the card and said, "Only this. I started the writing. You will finish the writing. There will be no more secrets in this family." Oma died in October of 2022 in her chair at the kitchen table with the small recipe box open in front of her and a fresh index card half written in her hand. The doctor said it was a stroke. Annie was 20. She did not cry. She came home from her shift at the diner in Stonewall and found Oma in the chair, and she sat down on the floor beside the chair and laid her cheek against Oma's cool hand, and she stayed there until the funeral home came. She finished the half-written card herself 3 weeks later and signed the bottom with both their initials, EB/A. B, and only when the card was done did she sit down beside the cold wood stove and finally let herself cry. The little limestone house in Cherry Spring belonged to the bank because Oma had taken a small second mortgage on it during her last sickness to keep Annie in the small college Annie had not yet been able to finish. And within 4 months of Oma's funeral, the bank had come to the kitchen table and asked her to be out by the 1st of the month. She had left with the small brass spice scale in her workshirt pocket, the thumbed index card with the 3 faded words folded into the same pocket, the small mountain laurel recipe box wrapped in 2 clean dish towels in a paper grocery sack, a single suitcase, and the photograph of 3 women standing in the doorway of the Smokehaus at Hoogle Bend in 1904. If these stories are reaching you tonight, take a second to subscribe. It truly does help us keep making them. And tell us in the comments, was there ever a recipe, a word, a small thing your grandmother taught you only by doing that you are afraid will end with you? The door of the cottage let her in with the dry scrape of a swollen jam, and Annie stepped inside, and the first thing was the heat. Texas hill country heat held inside a closed limestone house through a long August, the cool stone walls still cool, but the trapped air heavy and still and dry as a kiln. And then, under the dry heat, the smell. The faint, persistent smell of 60 years of post-oak smoke and black pepper and cured pork that lives in the limestone of an old smokehouse, the way the smell of incense lives in the limestone of an old village church. She breathed it in, and she did not cry, but her hand went to her shirt pocket and found the small brass spice scale, and she closed her fingers around it. The cottage was 2 rooms, the front room a kitchen with a black cast-iron wood stove and a long pine table, the back room a sleeping room with a rope bed against the wall. Through the kitchen's back door, across a swept flagstone courtyard, stood the smokehouse. She walked across the courtyard in the late afternoon hill country sun, set her hand on the iron latch, and pushed the door open, and the smell that came out of the smoke chamber was the smell of her Oma's smokehouse in Cherry Spring, exactly. She stood in the doorway a long moment. Then she stepped inside. The iron meat rods were still in place across the chamber, 8 of them, the iron darkened 60 years black. The cold side door for the firebox still hung on its hinges. The walls were black with 60 years of pitch, and in the back wall of the chamber, in the 3rd course of limestone blocks up from the floor, 1 block sat just a little, almost imperceptibly, proud of the rest. Not enough that a stranger would see it. Enough that a daughter who had been taught by Oma to read a smoke and a meat and a stone and a hand might. She slept the first night on the rope bed under her work coat. She woke before dawn and walked back to the smokehouse and stood in front of the chamber and remembered the 3rd rule. Niemals den Rauch. And under the 3rd rule, she remembered something Oma had said one Sunday afternoon over coffee when Annie was 15. The old smokehouses, child, the good ones. They keep what is dearest in the limestone, because the limestone does not burn, and the limestone does not rot, and the limestone does not give up what a careful hand has set inside it. Annie reached out and laid her hand on the proud block. She worked her fingertips along the mortar seam at one edge, and the mortar there was softer than the mortar around the other blocks, the way a careful mason makes a seam if he wants it to be undone one day. She fetched the small iron poker from the firebox and worked the soft seam, gently, patiently, for the better part of an hour, and the block came free with a small, dry sigh of old mortar. Behind the block was a dry, square cavity in the limestone 2 feet deep, lined with cedar that had not rotted in 121 years, and inside the cavity sat a small flat wooden box of mountain laurel wood and a heavy canvas sack. She did not cry. She lifted the box out first. She carried it across the courtyard, set it on the long pine table in the cool morning light, pressed her open palms against the soft wood, and breathed in the cedar and post oak smell that came up out of the seam of the lid, the smell of her whole childhood. Then she lifted the lid. Inside the box were index cards, hundreds of them. The same size as the cards in Oma's box, but older. The paper yellowed soft at the edges. The ink faded to a brown that was almost the color of weak coffee. The writing in 3 hands. The cards were the entire working archive of the Smokehaus at Hoogle Bend. Every sausage, every cure, every smoke schedule, every spice blend by exact weight. The first card was for a coarse smoked wurst, dated October the 14th, 1904. The last card was for a Christmas Eve ham dated July the 3rd, 1985. Behind the cards, tucked at the back flat against the cedar, was a heavier piece of folded butcher's paper sealed with red wax. The wax bore the small, clear impression of a brass spice scale, the same scale Annie had in her shirt pocket. She broke the seal with her thumb. To whatever Brower daughter walks into this smokehouse and reads a stone. My name is Wilhelmina Brower, born Wilhelmina Hahn in the village of Niedereisenhausen in the state of Hessen in the year 1823. The youngest of 4 sisters, and the only one my father, who was the village butcher, taught the trade to because I was the only one who asked. I came to Texas in the autumn of 1846 on a ship of the Adelsverein with my first husband, Johann Brower, who died of the cholera on the trail north from Indianola, and I walked the last 40 miles to Fredericksburg with my wooden trunk on a borrowed mule. I came to this curve of the Pedernales in 1853, and I bought these 3 acres with 6 years of work at Caspar Ottmer's shop, and I cut the limestone for this house in this smokehouse out of the bluff at the back of the lot with my own hands and the hands of my second husband Heinrich. I'm writing this letter on the same morning I'm writing the first card. I have decided, after 46 years of refusing, to write the recipes down. My mother taught me that a written recipe was a recipe a stranger could steal. My mother was wrong, daughter. A written recipe is a recipe a daughter can find. An unwritten recipe is a recipe that dies. I have watched 2 of my sisters in Germany die without daughters, and the recipes of my mother and my grandmother die with them. I will not be the 3rd. I am writing them all down in this box, and I am sealing the box inside this limestone wall, because no one but a Brower woman who has been taught to read a stone will think to look behind a block that sits a little proud of the others. The gold in the sack beside this box is 41 years of savings of this smokehouse, put away 1 or 2 pieces at a time. I am leaving it for you. Buy the post oak for 1 season. Buy salt for 1 year. Buy a new tin roof. And then earn the rest the way I earned it, by smoking meat for people who will sit down at a Sunday table with their children and grandchildren around them and not know your name. The trade is not the recipe, daughter. The trade is the hand. The recipe is what we leave when we cannot hand the trade across the kitchen table anymore. Read the cards, smell the smoke, mind the wood. And remember always, niemals den Rauch ohne die Liebe, never the smoke without the love. With my whole hand and my whole heart, Wilhelmina Brower, Smokehouse woman, Hoogle Bend, Gillespie County, Texas, the 14th of October, 1904. Annie laid the letter flat on the pine table. She set her open palm across it. She did not cry. She closed her eyes and breathed in the cedar and post oak smell of the box and the smell of her Oma's kitchen, and the tight thing that had lived in her chest since the morning the bank had come to the kitchen door, loosened by some small amount that finally had a name. The name was home. She drove the gold pieces down to a dealer in San Antonio the following week, A careful elderly man named Mr. Otto Schroeder, who valued the coins, 63 Mexican gold 10 peso pieces and 17 American $5 gold pieces at $38,400. She sold a third of them. She put $11,000 in a savings account at the Fredericksburg Credit Union, and she drove back up the county road with a new section of tin for the roof, 100 new sausage casings, a cord of split-post oak, 4 new iron meat rods, and a single new white linen apron, because Oma had always said a smokehouse woman puts on a clean apron on the morning of the first smoke of a new year. She did not do it alone. By the second week of September, the news had walked the county road the way news walks a hill country county road, slowly and certainly and through the side door, and the chorus had begun to arrive. The first was Mr. Reinhard Kessler himself, who closed the records office at 4 o'clock on a Thursday and drove down with a paper bag of his wife's Pfeffernusse and a coil of new copper gasket. "Your great-great-grandmother gave my grandfather a Christmas ham on credit the winter of 1907, he said. I came to fix what I can. The next was Mrs. the Hannelore Mueller, 76, who drove down with a tin of Kuchen and a small linen-wrapped loaf of Roggenbrot and a linen bag of caraway seed. Your Oma made the Christmas ham for our family for 41 years. I came to bring you bread. Old Mr. Hartman came down with a cord of post oak. Mrs. Bettina Kraus brought 3 jars of pickled green beans and a basket of late peaches from the wild orchard her grandfather had planted, with the simple word that the orchard had been Wilhelmina's first, in 1860. A young man named Joachim Lindner drove down unasked with a length of new stovepipe for the firebox. And the steadiest was Mr. Kessler, who closed the records office every other Thursday and sat at the long pine table and read aloud to Annie from Wilhelmina's recipe cards, card by card. He always laid his hand on the doorframe on his way out and always said the same thing. The smokehouse is in good hands. The first smoke of Annie's run came on the last Saturday of October. She lit the post oak fire at 4 in the morning, fed it short and dry, and walked out into the cold Blue Hill country pre-dawn and watched the smoke come up in the first thin, pale blue plume Wilhelmina's chimney had thrown in 63 years. She made 41 pounds of wurst that first morning by Wilhelmina's first card. By 10 that night, the smokehouse at Hugel Bend was filled with the warm, sweet smell of finished sausage, and 3 pickup trucks had pulled up at the end of the county road, headlights off, parked at a respectful distance, men and women out of the cabs not speaking, watching the pale blue smoke come up out of the chimney the way their fathers and grandfathers had watched it come up 63 years before, and not one of them said a word. That is the thing about the smoking our grandmothers tried to hand us. It is not really about the meat. The meat is the wage. The smoke is the trade. The trade is the post oak fed short and dry, and the salt weighed careful, and the cards left in a cedar-lined wall for a daughter to find 120 years later. And the trade is, above all, the rule the old women would never write down until the very end. Niemals den Rauch ohne die Liebe. Never the smoke without the love. Anneliese Brouwer was 22 years old and homeless. She had $3 to her name, and she spent them on a limestone block smokehouse on a curve of the Pedernales River in Hugel Bend, Texas. It was the best $3 she ever spent. If this story has kept you company tonight, thank you for sitting up with us. Sleep well, breathe easy, and see you in the last warm light of the day.